welcome back. It's a new year, new content, 2025. Back in the studio today with Mr. Bill Westfall. Bill, welcome.
Thanks again.
Did you have a good New Year?
Good New Year. Good year all in the whole, yes.
And now we're out of the snow and blistery cold, so hopefully we'll hang on to that for a while. But we have a couple things we want to talk about today. Bill and I have been discussing recently kind of the division that we've seen the last year in the country overall, and frustrations that some people are holding, and how that can many times bleed into our work lives and our teams and organizations. And Bill has some great examples and some tools to use about what we do when we get to feeling that way. So Bill, you had a great friend, Brunacini, passed away a handful of years ago. I had the fortune of meeting him, chatting with him a handful of times, taking him to lunch once downtown during the FDIC convention, which was a great experience for me because he was a celebrity in his realm. And we actually had young firemen coming up and getting his autograph from his book that he had written in the restaurant. They happened to be carrying it around with him, taking selfies and those types of things. So you spent much more time with him, got to know him over a long period of time, got to really take some deep dives with him. And you've got some good examples about how we can not only handle our stress and frustrations and just being nice to each other.
Exactly. Yeah, he was, I've really been fortunate. I've met a lot of really remarkable people, private and public sector, and he certainly was one of those. But I also say he was not only just remarkable, but he was an individual that was not only smart, but he was also very wise.
Yeah.
And I found this fascinating, and especially when you look at organizational culture, because he went to Phoenix Fire Department in 1954, and I'll share this with you. He said, my first impression, he said, the first firehouse I went to, he said they were all drunks. They were out in the cars with women instead of being in the firehouse, you know.
While they're working, you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So he said, I transferred. And the next firehouse was much the same way. And he said, I figured out at that point in time the key to this solution was not to, or the solution to this was not to transfer. It was get promoted and changing. But he says that with no ego whatsoever. It was a passion. And that's the great thing about him. He said, I was 4 years of age and I was standing in the front seat of my family car and I saw a fire engine go by and I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And he truly did. So he was at Phoenix, I think, for almost 50 years total. I think 48 years total, where he was chief for like 25 of it. But changing that culture, how do you change a culture that complex? And he said one of the advantages he had, it grew exponentially, and he grew with it. So it wasn't like he had to overcome this monstrous thing. But if you will, he said, I got my master's degree, and I was sitting there over breakfast one morning talking with my wife, and I was like telling her about Maslow and whatever, you know. And finally, she said, you know, Ellen, it's just not that complicated. Just be nice. And I just blew her off. It was like, he said, you know, what are you really, you know? But he said, 25 years later, he said, I'm sitting in my office, and I got this 3-page note from what he called Mrs. Smith, with the public, about a kitchen fire. And he said the first thing they talked about was, they got there in you know, almost immediately and put out the fire almost immediately. And that was the first half page. But the other 2.5 pages were about, but once they were done with that, they made sure that my home was functioning properly, that I had a kitchen that had food, and that I could have a way to be able to heat or cool or whatever I had to do in my home. So they went what we call +1, above and beyond what was required of them.
Sure.
And I realized that really what she was impressed with was not their efficiency, but basically their kindness and the fact that they were considerate of her. So he said, after 25 years, I decided that I would listen to my wife.
Yeah.
And so then he said, the first thing I did is I introduced the kind. He said, we got a new initiative here. And he says, we're going to be nice. And he said, his firefighter said, okay. And he goes, well, that was easy. But he said, no, it wasn't. He said, he realized, but, well, what do you need? He said, about being nice. Well, he actually, if you allow me, I want to refer to the notes so I don't...
Sure.
He said,
no, absolutely.
He defined this as kindness, consideration, patience, and respect. Kindness, the way you treat others and manage your own. Patience, especially if they're very young or very old, because they pay attention to that. Consideration, where does it hurt and how can I help? And respect means never look down on anybody.
Yeah.
And then he actually had little tags that he would put on the memos that said, just be nice, basically. So I asked him, I said, how do you change a culture, though, that complex with just 2 words?
Sure.
And one of the things he told me is that they called him the little bastard. And he said that one of the things...
The firemen called him that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they would just say, just do it, because the little bastard never gives up. And this is where this comes in, this term of gentle pressure relentlessly applied, which wasn't his, but he applied it so well there. And what he meant by that is, and this has been likened to your organization, private or public sector, is this huge ball hanging from a ceiling, and your mission is to move it or change it a bit.
Sure.
And he said most of us would, grab the biggest sledge we could find and back off and hit it as hard as we can. Well, if you do the physics of that, versus, he said, just a child just walks up and leans against it, and it doesn't move much, but it starts to move.
Sure.
And then you back off. And then what? And that's that persistence, you see, that ultimately over time. And if you remember Jim Collins' Good to Great, where he talks about the flywheel again, the same application. Once you got the flywheel to make a revolution, now you can refine and you can improve, basically. So
it's momentum over time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
So one of the things that I remember him talking about, Alan Brunacini, when we had lunch with him, was his downtime and how he utilized that, because you have it a lot in the private sector, but in the public sector it's more predominant when you have elected officials that change, and then your boss changes, and everything changes. And many a times I've seen that initiatives, programs, as great as they might be for the public and everyone else, they get thrown out because it has the person before them's name on it.
Yes. Yeah, that's a tough issue, but that's where the persistence comes in, the consistency comes in, I think, and he was a role model for that. He was driven by that, but he also was wise enough to let them take the definitions he gave them and then translate that into, and that's what he looked for. You see, one of the things they did I thought was really unique, because we went out and just watched fire companies that had a reputation for being notoriously nice.
Yeah.
And that's how they came up with their definitions then. But then what you saw, and this is what he looked for, and this is what he would reward then, he would see people translate that in their own ways. And he gave example after example. Firehouse, one thing about Firehouse, and when you agree with this, firefighters can do anything. They're carpenters, or they're plumbers, electricians. And he said, we had this one guy one day that was, let's take this example. It was a barber shop, and the barber actually had a heart attack. And so they came in, of course they treated him and got him from the scene. Well, one of the guys on the team happened to be a barber. He finished the guy's haircut for him. Now think about that for a moment, because they start translating that into being nice, plus one kinds of things they could do. He said, we might have had 300 runs that day, but only one of them made the paper. Which one was it?
The guy who got his haircut finished, right?
Exactly. Now, how does that translate into the politics of it, then, in a sense of support, basically? And he gave me this example, which I never forgot. If you look at everything, just whether it's private or public sector, when you start looking at budget, the first thing we're taught to look at with a good MBA is cost of everything.
Sure.
What he understood, you also have to look at value. And he gave me a great example, which I never forgot, how he then played that. He said, because he had such a reputation with his public, when he would ask for a hook and ladder at $1.5 million, like that, the public would say, give it to them, and the politician doesn't like that because it takes their discretion away from them.
Sure.
So they, behind closed doors, they said they're unmerciful on his budget. And they asked him one time, how come you send all that equipment to a scene with injury, accident with injury? He said, well, because I need it. Well, good accountants as they are, they said you only need it 7% of the time. So why don't you just send one piece of vehicle or one vehicle, do your triage, and then call for what you need. Well, sometimes you need it in that golden moment, if you would. And so he said to them, he said, well, sometimes I need it right then. They said, yeah, but only 7% of the time. So what they're saying, let 7% of the people suffer, and maybe even somewhat die, basically.
Right.
And so he said to them, he said, well, let me ask you this then. Which piece of equipment should I leave back at the firehouse for your husband, your wife, or your daughter, son, whatever it might be, someone in your family? And this was so revealing, because they kind of stood back and said, well, that's different. And he said, no, it's not, because it's either son. And so he said that, told that story, and he says, I love them, they're good people. He said, but he said, it's this constant cost and value thing. He said, they understand the cost of everything, but the value of absolutely nothing. Now, that's not an indictment. What that is advice. So you've got to sell them now on the value against that cost, and it helps define our role then. So if you can see how that translates then into especially impact when we're trying to produce product, be it on the private sector or a service in the public sector.
Yeah, he got them to attach themselves to the need, and then things changed for them. So it opened up their 360, if you will, expanded their perspective. Yeah. One of the stories I also heard him tell is very similar to the barbershop one, was a guy who had a heart attack in his front yard cutting the grass.
Yes, that's another one. I'll tell you the one even better than that. And the same thing is that they treated the man and got him taken care of, but then they finished cutting his lawn. But I'll tell you, this was the one that really had an impact for me, is that they had one guy there was a construction outfit, and he was just laying a driveway, and he just got it all screeded and laid out. Basically, he had a heart attack and fell into it. So he's already
into the wet concrete.
Yeah, we're talking $15,000-$20,000 worth of concrete there, evidently. And so when they got there and you let that set up, you're going to have to take at least that section out. Well, what they did as soon as they treated him, got him out of there, they called the Brown brothers over at the firehouse on their cement guys. They came over and finished it out basically. And so it's those kind of things that build the goodwill, and it's that +1 kind of thing and you can apply that private or public sector.
Sure. So. And we have a clip of Ellen, right, that you did a handful of years ago, really going in and talking about this.
And he just does a nice definition of the be nice. Yeah, it's worth looking at.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and show that.
I get together with firefighters when I have this religious experience, and I finally listened to my wife after 2.5 decades, and I said, okay, boys and girls, we got a new initiative. What's that? I said, we're going to be nice. They said, okay, let's eat. I'm thinking, this is too easy. Well, it was, because in the back of the room, they're firefighters, so that half of them have been to law school. I said, well, what do you mean about nice? How do you define nice, Chief Brunacini? I don't know how the hell. I know it when I see it, but I don't, So anyway, we go through this long exercise, and we actually videotaped fire companies that were notoriously nice. And we looked at it, and we came up with kindness, consideration, patience, and respect when we looked at the videos.
And you'd see those
there's probably
over and over again
8 or 10 other words you can use. They're all good words. They're kind of spiritual words when you think, we don't mean it in a spiritual way, we mean it in a service delivery way. We said, I can define it. So I went back with them. They had another meeting with a little bastard. And I said, okay, you asked me, and I'm told you, and here's what it means. Kindness means the way you treat people. It's the way you manage your own set of personal and professional capabilities, and the way you interact with them and interrelate with them. Patience is the fact that you will spend time with them, particularly if they're very young and very old, because they notice that a lot. Consideration is we ask them, where does it hurt and what can I do to help? And respect means don't ever look down on anybody.
So the good chief had several books, one of them being Customer Service, which he would highlight probably many of the stories that we're talking about, the themes, the lessons. But you talked a little bit earlier to me about modeling behavior, which I think is really important. And whether we're parents or in an organization. In Foundations, I talk a lot about how leadership is similar to parenting in theory, because we're taking people that we care for, we're trying to help them learn, grow, develop. Many a times we'll help them or attempt to help them prevent to make the same mistakes that we have. Now, generally they don't listen, especially at least my kids don't, right? And they have to figure it out for themselves. But when it comes to these examples, when it comes to really his overall career that he, I'm sure, explains much in these books overall. What do you think it was that really helped him? Now, we talk about his wife gave him the simple concept, which it took him 25 years, you said, to really apply and understand at a deep level. How was he able to implement that and be successful within an organization?
Well, I think one of the biggest pieces is that he role modeled it, and that's one thing I've seen consistent, whether it is parenting. And by the way, most of your leadership models, if you go back and look, used early on. They used child development models.
Oh, okay.
The very point that you make is that we're helping people hopefully to learn and to grow and grow with them.
Yeah.
But I've always been fascinated by, because I think myself, I can speak to that, I really struggled as a parent. And you'll parent the way you were parented. And I did not grow up as an example with a father and a good mother, but didn't grow up with that father. And I saw young men that grew up with really good foundational man or woman for that matter.
Sure.
And it makes a difference, because the lessons I was learning at 35, you learn at 15 if you're at home and you have good parenting, basically.
Sure.
So, but the thing that I think consistent through that, it wasn't so much what I'd hear people say that they remember their parents saying, but what their parents did.
Yeah.
So, again, we know how powerful the visual system is, basically. So, role modeling that, and then the persistence, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but they used to just say, just do it, because he never gives up, and that's that gentle pressure piece, the resolve. And he would change if he realized that he needed to, basically. But he was tenacious. So if you look at and look in the literature too, grit. Having that grit.
Yeah.
And I've always said this, there's a passion for the work, or play for that matter, but the passion will always outperform the bureaucracy. And that's the key.
So for him it was, I'm going to model this and then invite others to do the same.
And then reward it when he sees it immediately.
Okay.
And he did a lot of that.
That's a big important piece.
He videotaped, go out and go and videotape these pieces basically, and then would reward it. And then, obviously, if you look at the organization, how it was rewarded basically because of its performance, especially when they needed resources. So.
Sure. And then they knew that basically he had their back.
Absolutely.
Because he knew that they were trying to do the right thing, and even if they made mistakes, they were mistakes of the mind, not mistakes of the heart.
And he really understood the business from the ground up. So,
yeah, well, I think, there's so many lessons in customer service that can be applied really to any sector or industry, for that matter.
Warren Buffett says that. I just saw a clip on him recently, just basically talking about, he said, make your customer happy. Give them an example. He said that they'll not forget, because they'll come back. I have done that. I've gone places I know are going to cost me a little bit more maybe, and maybe in interest rates or whatever it might be, but the service that I got there was worth it to me.
Sure.
So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So I think along the same lines kind of the be nice really ties into an example we have from our friends at Arbinger. So Chip Huth, who was on the Kansas City Police Department for several years and now is a full-time consultant with them, tells a story about his SWAT team, and they had served a warrant on a drug house, and after making entry, there's all kinds of people in the house, men, women, children. They get everyone secured. They're going through and doing all the processes, and apparently there were 3 or 4 babies in there with the mothers. And so after the initial shock and awe is done of that, and they start to settle down, they're still crying, and one of the officers asks the mothers what's going on, and she lets him know it was feeding time, basically. So Chip tells a story of walking through the house and performing all of his tasks he needs to do as a supervisor of this operation, and he looks into the kitchen and he sees one of his SWAT guys in there in full tactical gear mixing baby bottles for all 3 or 4 of the kids that were in there. And the story goes, Chip kind of stops and looks at him, and he sees him and turns around and just gives him a smile and a shrug and goes back to it. And so the big piece that we take from Arbinger and Teaching Foundations is that how can we get to the point to where we have the awareness of how can we do what we're doing, accomplish our own goals, but do those in a way that's beneficial, helpful to others, and in this case, impactful. Like, hopefully that's something that those mothers never forget. And no matter what they think and how frustrated they might get with the police moving forward, they'll remember the day that one of them took a minute to make their child a baby bottle. And so I feel like that mentality, that mindset, if you will, Arbinger calls it outward mindset, really rolls right into what the chief was doing with his team, with his city, and the be nice concept overall.
When we get our... we can stop thinking about ourselves and thinking about others, it's remarkable the performance levels we take people to. And you see it all the time on the battlefield as an example.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that was a great example of that officer. And quite honestly, and I bet you've seen the same thing, we have officers doing hundreds of things like that every day. And the sad thing is so often they don't get pat on the back that they should get for doing that. And
Sure.
they keep doing it. So, but that says something about the culture.
Well, and those are the things in a workplace. So we do annual awards for employees.
Yes.
Those are coming up here next month in February. And so as a director, I sit on the panel that puts in the nominees, and we just did that last week. And those are the things that you hear about. Those pieces where people are selfless and they still get their work done. They're not doing work for other people that doesn't belong to them, but they're doing what they can to chip in. And those are the people that we have to make sure in our organizations that we recognize, that we're praising. Like you said, that was one of the chief's biggest pieces. When he saw that, we would praise it and then follow up on it. Because then that invites other people, when they see the culture's built off of this behavior. And it was also, we saw it in police academies before, where the kids come in and regardless of what type of behavior they are, naturally, that boot camp, and I'm sure it happens in the military, breeds, oh, we need to be this type of personality to be successful. If we breed the be nice, if we breed the outward mindset in our organizations, and everyone sees that's what you get rewarded for, that's what the company wants to be successful, then that can pay dividends for years to come as well. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming in today, Bill. Appreciate you doing this tribute to the chief. Great guy. And just thankful and blessed that I had a chance to spend a couple days with him over the years and chat and get kind of his take on things. So I really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
All right. Until next time, thanks a lot.